Hello, and welcome to Relax History. Tonight, we travel not through wars or rulers, but through bedrooms, porches, and prayer corners. The quiet spaces where Americans of the 1800s closed their eyes. They slept beside strangers, beneath quilts, alive with fleas. To the sound of hooves, bar fights, or whispered gossip through a thin wall. There were no mattresses as we know them, just straw, rugs, or someone else's shoulder. And yet, sleep still came. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where your mind slows down? And if this kind of soft human history helps you rest, consider subscribing. I'll be here, unfolding the night, one forgotten detail at a time. Close your eyes and imagine a quiet American town in the mid-1800s, just after midnight. The lamps flicker low. The streets, cobbled or earthen, are mostly silent. But beneath the stillness, a sour, pungent scent clings to the air. It is the smell of a city's unspoken problem: night waste, before modern sewage systems, before underground pipes and street sanitation crews. American towns functioned on a fragile balance of private waste management and public tolerance. The concept of a toilet inside a houselet alone, one with plumbing, was rare. Instead, outhouses were the standard. Wooden sheds out back, one seat, no light, and, for many, no desire to visit them after dark. Nighttime brought hesitation, whether it was the fear of stepping on a snake, getting mugged, or simply losing one's way in the dark. Few willingly made the trip to the privy. That's why chamber pots became a fixture of domestic life. And once those pots were used, many were not emptied properly the next morning. Instead, the solution, if one could call it, that was to toss the contents out the window or door. Sometimes with a warning yell, gardilu, a holdover from earlier European traditions. But many didn't bother. In tightly packed neighborhoods or back alleys, waste simply trickled into the streets. In summer, it dried into dust. In winter, it froze into dangerous, slippery ridges. Either way, it was ever present. The result: streets that reeked of rot, piss, and decay. Horses added to the mix. Dead animals, fish heads, butcher scraps, mingled with human waste in gutters and roadside puddles. Rain might help wash it away, but in dry spells, the buildup was unbearable. Visitors commented on it. Foreign travelers arriving in Boston or Baltimore often noted the indelicate air. Some even refused to sleep with their windows open, no matter the heat. City dwellers developed strong stomachs, or tried to. Residents walked carefully, especially at night, lest they step in something left behind by a careless neighbor. But the issue wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Cholera outbreaks swept through towns in waves. Typhoid and dysentery thrived in the filth. Doctors began to suspect a connection, though germ theory was still emerging. Municipal councils, often slow to act, debated expensive sewer projects, while the waste piled higher. And yet, people survived. They adapted. They held scented handkerchiefs to their faces. They built raised wooden walkways to avoid the filth. Children learned to skip puddles without thinking. It was life, smelly and stubborn. But as towns turned to cities, and cities swelled with immigrants and industry, what finally pushed Americans to demand cleaner streets. By the late 1800s, American cities had reached a breaking point. The charm of horse-drawn carriages and candlelit evenings was soured quite literally by the mounting waste in the streets. And while most residents accepted the nightly stench as part of life, others began to demand something better. Sanitation reform didn't happen overnight. In fact, it began with panic, not planning. The cholera outbreaks that ravaged cities like New York, Cincinnati, and New Orleans shocked the public. Hundreds died in a matter of weeks, their deaths often attributed to miasma's bad air, while germ theory was still gaining ground. Many reformers correctly suspected that poor waste disposal was a major culprit in New York City. A turning point came in the 1840s with the appointment of the first Board of Health. Sanitation inspectors were hired. Privies were regulated. Cesspools, those underground pits used to store human waste, were ordered to be emptied more frequently. But enforcement was inconsistent, and landlords often ignored the rules. Then came the engineers. Men like George Waring began designing sewer systems that would carry waste away from living spaces entirely. Waring's most famous contribution in the 1890s was organizing New York's White Wings, a uniformed army of street sweepers dressed in white to symbolize cleanliness. Their daily rounds didn't just tidy the streets, they transformed public attitudes. Cleanliness became not just a preference, but a civic virtue. Other cities followed. Boston built underground tunnels to carry sewage. Chicago famously raised its entire street level to install sewers underneath. San Francisco, despite being a younger city, wrestled with waste control as its population exploded during the gold rush. Each town brought its own solution, with varying degrees of success, but none of this would have happened without public pressure. It was women, particularly those in urban reform movements, who advocated fiercely for cleaner living conditions. They lobbied for waste pickup, better drainage, and education on hygiene. They understood that filth didn't just affect the poor, it spread to everyone, rich or poor, when left unchecked. Slowly, the idea of sleeping with your window open became possible again. Streets grew quieter, and less fowls melling after dark. And while the chamber pot didn't disappear overnight, it was gradually replaced by indoor plumbing, a miracle of modern convenience made possible by miles of hidden infrastructure. And yet, even in cleaner cities, the memory of waste lingered. In old neighborhoods, locals still remembered the smells, the nightly routines, the quiet shame of tossing a pot out a window. And they remembered the first mornings they awoke to fresh, clean air, wondering if perhaps the city had turned a corner. But what about those places where reform never came, where the stink still settled over rooftops and the streets never dried out? In the romantic imagination, 19th century nights are often remembered as silent and still, lamplight glowing softly, horses clip-clopping in the distance, and the wind sighing through wooden slats. But the reality was far less serene. In most American towns and cities, the nighttime air echoed with life, loud, raw, and often unruly. Many towns had no noise ordinances, and streets weren't empty after sunset. In fact, after sundown was when a different kind of economy emerged. Vendors hawked late-night goods, fishmongers and bread sellers called out at dawn, and peddlers tried to offload wares long into the evening. Some cities even had night criers, unofficial announcers walking up and down streets shouting the time or repeating rumors of fire or crime. Taverns, meanwhile, never truly slept. Singing, shouting, and the scraping of chairs against dusty floorboards spilled out into the street. The drunken arguments of travelers, laughter, and slurred toasts to the past week could carry 4 blocks in the quiet chill of a wooden town. Dogs barked at passing carts. Roosters, confused by lantern light, crowed at odd hours. Stagecoaches arrived at all times of night, their heavy wheels rattling along cobbled roads or dirt paths. Inns lit their candles when the sound of hooves echoed nearby, sometimes at midnight, sometimes before dawn. Guests were roused. The stable hands woke to tend horses. Sleep was often shallow and easily disturbed. In some boarding houses, guests slept close to the window's thin glass panes that did little to muffle the sound. Others lay near shared walls, hearing neighbors stir, snore, argue, or rise for the outhouse. There was no such thing as acoustic insulation. Walls were often single-layered wood, and floors creaked no matter how carefully one stepped. Even churches were not always quiet places. Nighttime bell tolls rang to mark deaths, emergencies, or changes in the hour. In some towns, bells tolled each hour through the night, a reminder of time, a reminder that someone was always awake. For those trying to sleep, mothers, workers, travelers, the night was a chorus of interruptions. Sleep was often caught in patches, interrupted by shouting or by the sound of something unknown. Dreams came in fragments. It makes one wonder, how did people ever feel rested in a world where silence was so rare? In modern life, silence is considered a luxury essential for deep rest, meditation, or concentration. But for much of the 1800s, Americans didn't just tolerate noise, they accepted it as part of life. The very idea of quiet time was foreign to many communities, especially in bustling towns or frontier settlements. Inns and boarding houses were rarely designed with peace in mind. Rooms were often divided by thin wooden panels or blankets nailed up for privacy. A conversation in the next room could be heard almost word for word. Creaking floorboards from above might jolt you awake. And in multi-story inns, the sound of boots on stairs or chamber pots being emptied outside was a nightly occurrence. People adapted. Those who could afford it might request a corner, room farthest from the street and upstairs, away from the front door. Some even stuffed cloth around window panes or under doors to muffle noise. But for most, rest was learned through habit, not conditions. In certain cities, street musicians added to the din. Fiddlers, accordion players, or banjo pickers would roam blocks, especially near taverns, playing for coins long into the night. Some families found these sounds familiar, even comforting. A song at midnight might signal that all was still as it should be. In coastal towns, the crash of waves and distant foghorns replaced the clamor of human life. But even there, dock workers and fishing crews stirred before dawn, calling to each other as they prepared boats or unloaded cargo. The town might never truly fall asleep. Even official roles contributed to the noise. Town watchmen shouted hourly updates, 2 o'clock, and all's well, as they patrolled. In the event of a fire, they rang bells and called neighbors by name. A barking dog was sometimes a signal of danger, or simply of a raccoon near the henhouse. Instead of resisting noise, people often folded it into their experience of the night. Many wrote in diaries about a restless night without complaint. It was just a fact of life. Others mentioned dreams shaped by the sounds around them, a dog barking turning into thunder in a dream, or footsteps outside becoming part of a nightmare. So much of rest in the 1800s came down not to how quiet the night was, but how tired you were. Work wore people out, travel drained them, and so, even amid shouting and song, they slept. But that raises the question, was rest ever truly peaceful, or simply the body giving in, no matter the noise? Not all travelers in the era of the 1800s could afford a full night's stay at a fine inn. For many, rest came at a price, and that price was often charged by the hour. In cities and along busy travel routes, a peculiar business grew. Public sleep, sold in fractions of time to those who simply needed a break from the road or the cold. Hourly beds were not luxurious. They were often in common rooms, lined with bunks or straw mats, each labeled with a rate, 2 cents for an hour, 5 cents for the cot with a sheet, or a nickel for a blanket. Signs like these hung outside lodging, basements, and alley entry houses. The clientele was just as varied. Sailors waiting for their next job, salesmen with one night between towns, farmers who missed the last stagecoach. Sheesh found brief shelter in these paper rest spots. These spaces were not meant for deep sleep or comfort. They were meant for necessity. Privacy, of course, was minimal. Men lay shoulder to shoulder in large halls. Some slept sitting up on benches, others curled in corners. An attendant might keep time with a pocket watch, tapping shoulders when hours were up. If you were late to pay or overstayed your slot, you could be nudged out, or worse, have your belongings tossed into the street. This system wasn't limited to the poor. Even wealthy passengers, delayed by weather or mechanical failure, sometimes found themselves stranded in cities without proper accommodations. Hourly rest stops offered a brief escape, just enough time to close one's eyes, loosen boots, and escape the cold drafts outside. In colder months, firewood was rationed. Some inn sold heat access, letting people sleep closer to the fireplace for an extra coin, and if there was a storm, the rooms would fill quickly, transforming into snoring, coughing hives of half-asleep humanity. Most travelers carried their own sleeping gear, a roll of cloth, a shawl, or even a straw-filled pillow. These personal items served as both comfort and protection. Laying your head on a stranger's pillow, after all, was rarely a good idea. In these hourly houses, sleep was not a luxury. It was a commodity timed, managed, and paid for. Still, for many, even an hour on a rough blanket beat a night spent walking freezing streets or waiting in a crowded coach station. But this leads to another question. When sleep becomes something you rent by the hour, what kind of dreams does it allow? If you've never shared sleep with dozens of strangers, you might not realize how much of it depends on rhythm. In the hourly sleep houses of the 1800s, time wasn't just a schedule, it was a rule. Every sleeper knew they were on borrowed rest, and every minute felt like a negotiation with their own exhaustion. A room full of people sleeping in shifts required careful management. Some attendants used bells, others tapped with sticks. A few just opened doors and let the cold air do the work. New arrivals shuffled in while half-asleep guests stumbled out, often blinking at the dark street like they were waking from a dream they barely entered. Snoring, coughing, and murmured sleep talk became the background soundtrack of these places. No one expected silence. Etiquette was strange. You didn't look too long at your sleeping neighbors, but you also didn't turn your back completely. Trust was always uncertain. Theft was a risk, and many slept with coin purses tucked under belts or boots on their hands to keep them safe. In some larger cities, hourly lodgings became competitive. Proprietors offered extras like a free cup of broth, a dry towel, or access to shared slippers. There were even debates in local newspapers about whether selling rest in hourly portions was undignified or practical for a modernizing nation. In winter, these places became survival zones. Some managers allowed the truly desperate to huddle in corners even if they couldn't pay, while others swept them out as soon as time ran out. Stories circulated of men dying in alleys just feet from where others snored inside. The strangest part, people adapted. They learned how to fall asleep quickly, some within minutes, knowing they had only a small window. Others developed personal sleep rituals, a certain position, a scarf pulled over the eyes, a prayer whispered under breath. It was sleep. Yes, but it was also performance. Even the idea of dreaming changed. Some travelers reported having the same dream each time they slept in these rooms, possibly because the noise and smells anchored their minds to reality. Others claimed to wake more tired than before, as if the body resisted fragmented rest. In this strange system, rest was never guaranteed, but it was always bought. These hourly inns were not the quiet sanctuaries of home, but rather something closer to sleep theaters, places where men and women came to play their part in the ancient act of shutting one's eyes. But what happens to a society where even the most basic human need, dresses sold in fragments, watched by a clock, and interrupted by boots at the door? In the era of the 1800s, not everyone had a home, and not everyone needed one. For many Americans, especially in cities swelling with workers, immigrants, and wanderers, the solution was the boarding house. These were places where, for a modest fee, you could rent a slice of someone else's home, including the silence of night or the lack of it. Boarding houses were everywhere. Some were grand brownstones, filled with lace curtains and upright pianos. Others were converted barns or patched together row homes with crooked staircases and tin basins. But they all offered the same deal: a place to sleep, a shared table, and rules that stretched or snapped depending on the landlady's mood. Sleep in a boarding house was rarely private. Most renters had a small room, maybe 6 feet wide, with thin walls that let every sound through. You might lie down at night to the sound of the man next door humming, the woman across the hall coughing, or children crying in the next room over. It wasn't unusual for 10 or more people to share a single floor. Many houses offered cribs or cots in larger communal rooms. In some cases, renters didn't even get a full bed, just a folding canvas cot wedged between trunks or under stairwells. These spaces were meant for the working class, especially those with shifting jobs and irregular hours. Some beds turned over twice a day, with one person sleeping at night and another using the same spot during the day. For landladies, managing sleep schedules became a strange kind of household choreography. Some insisted on quiet after 10. Others allowed soft conversation or even nighttime music, so long as it didn't wake the baby or the boarder who worked the morning milk route. Sleep etiquette was a patchwork. You knocked before entering someone's space, but no one expected true privacy. Snoring was tolerated less. It rattled the windows. Some rooms smelled of pipe smoke and unwashed socks. Others were decorated with old lace and pressed flowers, an effort to create calm in chaos. Despite the noise, the crowd, and the narrow beds, many boarders found comfort in routine. The clang of pans in the kitchen below, the thud of boots coming home late, even the squeak of the landlady's floorboard shoes as she checked the locks before bed. These sounds didn't disturb sleep, they marked it. But in this strange mix of home and hotel, was anyone truly resting? Or were they simply learning to drift off under the weight of footsteps, voices, and borrowed walls? Life in a boarding house was a symphony of small noises. Even in the deepest hours of night, stillness was rare. A boarder turning in bed, pipes hissing in the wall, a stair groaning beneath a cautious step. These sounds stitched together the communal experience, reminders that no one truly slept alone. Most houses had rules, often pinned to the wall or recited like scripture. No visitors after dark, no boots on the furniture, no candles left burning after lights out. Yet these rules, like the walls themselves, were often thin. Whispered conversations slipped beneath doorframes. Lovers tiptoed across floors they didn't rent. Children crept downstairs for forbidden cookies. The creaks and murmurs of these homes weren't just random. They became codes. A certain knock meant your laundry was ready. 3 fast taps on a shared wall warned that the landlady was nearby. A drawn curtain over a hallway mirror might mean someone had passed away. And though sleep came in bits and pieces, rituals helped people drift off. Some sipped weak tea before bed. Others tucked letters from home beneath their pillows. Immigrants brought old lullabies and prayers, sung softly to the rafters. These personal habits mingled with the sounds of others' lives, creating a strange sense of intimacy. But there was unease, too. Boarding houses were filled with strangers, and not all were kind. Theft was common. Fights broke out over food, noise, or even misplaced socks. Rumors spread faster than fires. If a boarder left in the middle of the night, no one asked too many questions. The lines between public and private blurred in these homes. A boarder's cough could keep an entire floor awake. A late-night return meant tiptoeing past a dozen sleeping ears. Still, there was something oddly comforting about this. In a world full of chaos and poverty, here was a place where you were never quite alone. Cellars were sometimes rented out as the cheapest rooms, damp, dark, and full of beetles. Attics, too, though sweltering in summer and freezing in winter, offered peace for those who could afford the extra pennies. But it was in the middle floors, in the ordinary rooms with chipped paint and oil lamps, that most boarders learned to sleep, not despite the noise, but through it. Some even claimed they couldn't sleep in silence anymore, that they needed the familiar rhythm, the coughs, footsteps, and whispered goodnights to find rest. But was this truly rest, or just resignation? By the late 18s, American hotels had grown in both size and imagination. Gone were the small-town inns where travelers shared soup and stories around a fire. In their place rose grand city lodgings, places with velvet curtains, polished brass bells, and names like the Continental or the Victoria Arms. But no matter how fine the furnishings, one problem always crept in: noise. The walls, thin as newspaper, carried every whisper. In upscale hotels, this was more than an inconvenience, it was a threat to reputation. Scandals didn't knock, they slipped through cracks in the plaster. So, hotels got clever. They didn't eliminate noise, they buried it. Some installed water pipes that hissed constantly, masking conversation. Others used the clatter of dumbwaiters or the irregular rumble of coal chutes to disrupt eavesdropping. But perhaps the oddest solution was the thunderclap bed. This contraption wasn't literal thunder, but rather a design flaw turned feature. Springs were stiff, headboards loose, and any movement caused a dramatic racket: creaks, bangs, even shudders against the wall. When guests complained, managers smiled politely. Old building, they said, adds charm. But for those wanting privacy lovers, politicians, businessmen with secrets, it was perfect. Meanwhile, hallway carpets were worn thin from the boots of bellhops. Room service arrived with soft knocks and knowing eyes. Behind the front desk, ledgers kept track not only of rooms and payments, but of names, real and false. The night shift staff knew more than most. They saw which guests lingered too long at others' doors, which ones tipped for silence, which ones left without saying goodbye. Noise became a kind of currency, something to offer, manipulate, or guard against. And while the city outside roared with trolley bells and horseshoes, the real stories unfolded indoors, behind drawn curtains, beneath squeaking floorboards, between the lines of polite conversation, but with so many sounds: footsteps, moans, the rhythmic thud of a restless sleeper. How did one separate the ordinary from the suspicious? And did the hotels ever truly want to? In some of the grander establishments of 19th century America, silence itself could stir suspicion. Take the Astor House in New York, or the Palmer House in Chicago. Hotels, known not just for their luxury, but for the secrets they held. Diplomats stayed in adjacent rooms. Railroad tycoons met over quiet dinners. Actors, outlaws, and politicians often crossed paths without meaning to, or perhaps very deliberately. In this world, sound wasn't just a background element. It was a signal. Too much silence behind a door. Someone might be listening. Too many footsteps stopping outside your room. Best check the lock again. Hotel staff, especially maids and doormen, developed an ear for the unusual. They weren't just cleaning rooms or carrying luggage, they were unofficial information brokers. A servant who overheard a conversation about land deals might pass it along to a rival guest for a price. A porter who knew when a senator arrived late at night could make himself useful during the next campaign. The guests, too, learned to adapt. Some placed chairs against doors. Others brought their own pillows to muffle voices. The paranoid might rent adjoining rooms and sleep in the one without the reservation under their name. Whispered code words, tapped messages on shared walls, and accidental hallway run-ins became tools of a social game that mixed business with bedroom politics. But for every strategic schemer, there were ordinary people just trying to rest. A mother traveling with children, a widow relocating across states, a schoolteacher attending a distant funeral. They too endured the sleepless nights caused by other guests, secrets, walls trembling, muffled cries, the occasional crash of a bottle. Still, they stayed quiet, because in the etiquette of hotel life, complaining could make you the most noticeable person of all. So travelers adapted. Some carried earplugs made from wax or linen. Others kept journals, scribbling by candlelight, to pass the noisy hours. And still others lay awake, staring at cracked ceilings, wondering who else was awake, and why. Because in hotels like these, the danger wasn't just what you heard, it was what you weren't supposed to. And that leaves one to wonder, in buildings built to host strangers, were the loudest guests truly the ones with something to hide? Or were they the perfect distraction? Imagine checking into a quiet little inn, only to discover the floor beneath your bed echoed with piano chords, glass clinks, and hoarse laughter deep into the night. That was the reality for many travelers in 18th America. It wasn't unusual for small-town hotels, boarding houses, or stagecoach stops to share space with saloons. Sometimes they were side by side, but more often stacked. Lodgers slept in rooms directly above the noise. These sleepover saloon setups weren't a design flaw, they were a business decision. In a growing town, space was limited, and building vertically made financial sense. An innkeeper could collect rent from weary travelers upstairs, while earning a night's haul of whiskey sales from locals downstairs. A perfect profit sandwich. For travelers, however, it was a lesson in compromise. Rooms were often cheap, but came with strings, or, rather, strings attached to out-of-tune saloon pianos. The floorboards vibrated with foot-stomping dances. Walls shook when brawls broke out, and the scent of stale ale crept up through every crack and crevice. Sleep, for many, became a negotiation. Some lodgers stuffed socks or crumpled newspapers into their ears. Others simply waited, eyes open, hands folded, until the final bar stool scraped across the floor and the last drunk stumbled into the street. Interestingly, many guests grew used to the chaos. Some even preferred it. The predictable rhythm of a saloon offered a strange kind of comfort. As long as the piano played, the fights stayed downstairs. As long as voices laughed, no gun had been drawn. Women travelers, though fewer in number, had an even more complicated relationship with these arrangements. Traveling actresses, widows, or mail-order brides often found themselves needing a room in the only place that would rent to them. The saloon below added risk but also a kind of anonymity. In towns where everyone knew each other's business, a little noise could provide just enough cover. It's easy to romanticize the wild of the Wild West, but for many, the wild was simply a bad night's sleep above a bar fight. And so, one can't help but ask, what kind of dreams were born in rooms built over music, liquor, and secrets? By the mid-18s, saloons weren't just watering holes, they were the living, shouting heartbeats of many American towns. And if you found yourself lodging in a room above one, your sleep depended on the moods of the men downstairs. The construction of many of these buildings didn't help. Thin floorboards, no insulation, and poorly secured beams meant that every footstep echoed like a thunderclap above or below. At night, the floor was alive with motion. A spilled drink in the saloon could drip into the ceiling cracks. A brawl might rattle the nails loose from the joists. There are even reports of guests waking up to find plaster dust on their blankets shaken loose by stomping boots or thrown chairs. One guest in Nevada wrote in 1873, "The room trembled like a sheet hung in wind. I feared more for the structure than for my sleep." Some establishments tried to maintain separation. Certain hotels placed the saloon at the far end of the building. Others built stone foundations to dampen the sound. But in towns with few buildings and fewer regulations, such luxuries were rare. For employees of these buildings, bartenders, chambermaids, stable hands, the blur between saloon and in life was constant. A bartender might finish mopping blood off the floor, then roll into a cot 2 stories up. A maid might prepare beds while dodging the woozy flirtations of customers still lingering after closing. There was no such thing as quiet hours. Noise was as permanent as the wallpaper. Over time, a strange harmony developed. Regular guests would request corner rooms, the ones least likely to shake during late-night piano tunes. Others carried their own straw-stuffed pillows, shaped to muffle sound against their ears. Some swore by drinking just enough from the saloon downstairs to ensure a hard, dreamless sleep upstairs, and yet people kept returning. Lodging above a saloon wasn't just tolerated, it was accepted. In towns where options were limited, and every bed could mean the difference between safety and exposure, people learned to rest through the chaos. You might wonder how anyone could sleep through that kind of life. But perhaps the secret was this: it's not silence that ensures rest, it's routine. And for many, a predictable night of ruckus was better than the unknowns of the road. So the question lingers: was it the noise that kept them awake, or the quiet that they feared? In the refined drawing rooms of eastern cities, pillows might have been filled with goose down or even imported feathers. But out west, where practicality always outweighed comfort, a pillow was often whatever you could stuff into a cloth sack. Corn husks were plentiful, left behind after harvest, dried in the sun, and sometimes shredded for a softer texture. A traveler might arrive at an inn only to find their pillow was a knotted linen sack, crinkling every time they turned their head. And yet, to many, it was still a luxury. In some places, a folded coat or saddlebag had to do. The problem with corn husk pillows wasn't just the noise. They didn't mold to the neck or cradle the skull. Instead, They shifted unpredictably, gathering in corners or flattening entirely. Travelers often adjusted their pillow repeatedly, shaking it out or flipping it during the night, hoping to find a less irritating spot. There were worse alternatives. Sawdust-filled pillows, for instance, were common in rougher establishments. These tended to leak, causing fine wood dust to coat blankets and irritate the nose. Others offered haste-firm but scratchy. Insects occasionally came with the filling, hidden inside the dried stalks. To a tired traveler, any support was better than none. Some would stuff their own pillowcases with spare clothes, leftover grain sacks, or even gathered moss if they were camping nearby. If you were lucky, a good innkeeper might refill or fluff the pillows between guests, but more often than not, you took what was left behind. Still, in a world of dirt roads, sleepless rides, and hard labor, the pillow became a small but meaningful symbol of civilization. Even the lumpy, rustling kind offered a hint of domestic comfort. It marked the difference between lying down to sleep and simply collapsing. And maybe that's why people complained about pillows more than they changed them. In many guest logs, you'll find the same handwriting noting restless night due to husk noise right beneath supper was satisfactory. The food could be bland, the bed could be shared, but the pillow, well, that was personal. So what did it mean to lay your head down in I-teens America? Did the discomfort remind travelers of what they'd left behind or of what they still hoped to find? If you were staying in a roadside in around 1830, the pillow was rarely silent. Long before the age of memory foam and orthopedic support, the humble pillow was a noisy companion. Corn husks shifted like dry leaves in the wind, each movement crackling like a forest floor. In rooms shared with 2 or 3 strangers, one restless sleeper could rustle the entire group awake. These pillows weren't shaped for alignment. They were lumpy, uneven, and often flattened under pressure. A traveler who spent all day bouncing in a wagon seat or straining on horseback would lie down hoping for relief, only to find their necks stiffening further by morning. Complaints of crooked spine or pinched shoulder appear often in diaries, right alongside complaints about cold coffee or sour ale. Yet, pillow problems rarely prompted change. Innkeepers saw pillows as long-term investments. Replacing or refilling them took time and money, and most travelers were just passing through. Unless a guest was particularly wealthy or particularly vocal, things stayed as they were. It was quite literally a make-do culture. Some attempted clever workarounds, folding an extra blanket into a headrest, sleeping slightly upright against the bed frame, even using saddlebags or bundled shirts to supplement an underfilled sack. None of it guaranteed a good night's sleep, but it gave people a sense of control over anything about their night. The noise wasn't just irritating, it was revealing. In the dead of night, the creak of a bed or rustle of a pillow might betray your movements to others sharing the room. For lone women, runaway servants, or fugitive slaves, this was more than an annoyance, it was a threat. Silence could mean safety. On the flip side, some travelers came to expect the corn husk rustle as part of the nightly ambience. The sound, once disruptive, could become oddly comforting, reminding them they were indoors, not under open skies. It became part of the layered texture of American inns, the tap of boots in the hallway, the wind against wooden walls, and yes, the ever-present crinkle of someone shifting on their pillow. Sleep wasn't guaranteed in early American travel, but the cornhusk pillow noise, rough and frustrating, was one of the last things a traveler touched before giving in to exhaustion. And perhaps in that scratchy stillness, lying awake with the sound of husks and distant snoring, They wondered, was anyone truly comfortable back then? Or did everyone just learn to live with the rustle? In the stillness of an 18th century American inn, there was one object nearly every room shared, tucked beneath the bed or stashed behind a curtain: the chamber pot. Porcelain, tin, or plain ceramic, these humble containers were the nighttime toilet of choice, and they weren't optional. Most inns didn't offer indoor plumbing. If nature called during the night and the outhouse was yards away in the cold dark, the chamber pot offered a compromise between dignity and desperation. It was an unspoken agreement. Guests used them discreetly, emptied them quietly, and spoke of them rarely. But in practice, the pots were often full, poorly cleaned, or simply forgotten under the bed until the smell reminded someone. Chambermaids, those tasked with the worst of cleaning duties, often dreaded the clatter of a half-used pot or the slosh of one too hastily moved in shared rooms. These pots became a kind of midnight ritual, a quiet rustling of sheets, the faint scrape of ceramic on floorboards, sometimes a whispered apology. Privacy was a luxury, and in rooms where strangers slept side by side, even relieving oneself was a public act. Travel journals from the time are sprinkled with references to foul odors or unpleasant arrangements. Some mentioned guests who refused to use the pot, choosing instead to brave the outhouse, barefoot in the cold. Others made do with makeshift alternatives: wooden buckets, empty jugs, or simply waiting until sunrise. And the design: basic, a wide mouth, a steady base. Some had lids, but many didn't. Decorative ones might bear floral patterns or humorous inscriptions, but at the end of the day, they were what they were: functional, forgotten, necessary children. The elderly, the sick, these were the ones who relied most on them. And for women traveling alone or with children, the chamber pot was a small defense against the vulnerability of venturing outside at night. It gave them a barrier, however small, from exposure, judgment, and danger. But what happened to these pots in the morning? Who carried them out? Where were they dumped? The answers reveal even more about the unsavory backstage of 18's hospitality and the people who labored, silently and thanklessly, to keep the smell of civilization just barely masked. As dawn crept through the wooden shutters of Phaeton's Merrick inns, a quiet symphony of footsteps and water buckets marked the beginning of a daily ritual one few spoke of, but all relied on. It was the hour of emptying before guests stirred. Fully from their straw-stuffed mattresses, the chambermaids began their rounds. Young, often underpaid women, they bore the duty of collecting chamber pots, some still warm, others long neglected. These pots, filled with the remnants of the night, were carried down narrow halls, down creaking stairs, and out into back courtyards where the true work began. There was no modern sewage system to whisk the waste away. Instead, pots were emptied into privy pits, backyard trenches, or, in some towns, into the nearest gutter. In larger cities, like New York or Philadelphia, ordinances attempted to regulate this disposal, but in smaller inns or countryside stops, it was a matter of convenience. The stench was inevitable, the risk of spills constant. Guests might still be asleep while chambermaids moved swiftly and silently, careful not to drop a pot or let its contents splash. Yet accidents happened. Some records mention angry travelers awakened by overturned waste or the unbearable stench seeping from a hallway corner. And then there was cleaning. Pots had to be scrubbed by hand with lye, soap, or ash, sometimes boiling water. No gloves, no protective gear, just grit and necessity. They were rinsed, dried, and returned to their hiding spots, before the guests finished breakfast. A clean pot signaled readiness for the next night, though no one ever spoke of it. But chambermaids weren't the only ones involved. In busier inns, boys known as potboys or groom boys helped with disposal, especially for male guests. These children, some barely in their teens, carried pots like delivery men of discomfort. For them, the job was a first rung on the ladder of service work. They hoped to climb quickly. Despite the indignity, these routines were essential. A poorly emptied pot meant a foul room. A neglected pot meant illness. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera could fester in the forgotten contents of a single vessel. Sanitation was survival, and so as the sun rose over the taverns and stagecoach, stops of a young nation, unseen workers waged a quiet war against decay. With buckets in hand and noses turned away, they kept the inns clean enough to welcome the next weary traveler. But in towns that grew too fast or cared too little, what happened when this system collapsed? When the waste had nowhere to go and the streets themselves became privies? You may think of sleep as something simple, a nightly return to warmth and comfort. But in the era of the 1800s, comfort wasn't guaranteed, especially once the sun went down and the fire began to fade. Most homes and inns didn't have anything close to modern heating. There were fireplaces, yes, but they heated a room unevenly, leaving cold pockets and icy corners. If you were lucky, you'd fall asleep close enough to the hearth to catch some warmth. If not, your toes would go numb before your thoughts could settle. The fireplaces themselves had to be fed manually, often with logs split earlier in the day. And because wood was a precious resource, people rationed it carefully. They would let the fire burn down low at night, just enough to keep the room from freezing, but never high enough to waste wood while everyone slept. It wasn't uncommon to hear the logs hiss and die around midnight as embers glowed dimly in the darkness. Glass windows, if they existed at all, offered little insulation. Cold air leaked through cracks in the panes and frames. Many families used heavy curtains, not just for privacy, but to block drafts. In poorer homes, they tacked up blankets or even newspapers across the windows to seal in what little warmth remained. The beds themselves told another part of the story. Most were wooden frames with rope lattice that had to be tightened regularly, hence the saying, "sleep tight." On top of this sat a straw mattress or a feather tick, which offered softness but little insulation. Without proper bedding, the chill of winter crept right through the seams, so people layered. They layered bedding quilts, woven covers, wool, blankets, old coats, and they layered themselves, often sleeping in their clothes. Nightcaps weren't just fashion. They kept the head warm, especially in drafty rooms. Some even slept with warmed bricks wrapped in cloth, placed at their feet or under the covers, hoping the heat would last until dawn. Children were usually bundled together for warmth. A bed meant for two might sleep 4 or 5 if the cold demanded it. Body heat was one of the few reliable sources of warmth in the middle of winter, and yet, somehow, they slept. In rooms that steamed with breath and rattled with wind, they drifted into dreams, surrounded by the quiet hum of survival. It wasn't luxurious, but it worked most of the time. But what happened when the fire went out completely? What if the quilt wasn't enough? In the era of the 1800s, staying warm at night wasn't a solo endeavor, was a family operation. Behind every heavy quilt was a quiet story of resourcefulness, frugality, and care, stitched together one piece at a time. Most bedding was homemade, and quilts in particular became a symbol of resilience. Women and sometimes entire families would gather scraps of fabric from worn-out shirts, old dresses, or feed sacks. These bits of cloth, too tattered for daily use, found new life as part of intricate patchwork designs. Every stitch was hand-sewn, every square a tiny act of protection against the cold. But these weren't just pretty decorations. Beneath the outer layer, families stuffed quilts with whatever they had, cotton batting if they could afford it, or wool if they lived near sheep farms. In poorer households, people used carted scraps, shredded rags, or even dried leaves and straw for insulation. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the body heat in. The process of quilting wasn't rushed. Quilting bees, social gatherings focused around sewing allowed women to pool their labor. Neighbors came together, needles in hand, to help each other finish heavy winter quilts before the frost settled in. These events weren't just about stitching, they were also about stories, songs, quiet gossip, and passing down patterns. In a world where much of life was hard and solitary, this was warmth of another kind. Even inns and taverns, serving traveling strangers, had their own systems for keeping sleepers warm. Guests might find quilts that had served generations of passers-by, with faded patterns and rough repairs marking each layer of time. They rarely matched. Sometimes they smelled faintly of smoke, wool, or lavender tucked in by the innkeeper. Each bed was a collage of the practical and the personal. At the end of the day, warmth wasn't about luxury, it was about strategy. People slept with hot stones wrapped in flannel or warmed flat irons tucked at their feet. Some hung thick rugs along the walls to trap heat inside. A few even constructed wooden bed boxes, small chambers that trapped body heat beneath a canopy of blankets. There were no thermostats to adjust, no electric blankets to flip on. Comfort came from human ingenuity, from the quiet knowledge passed down over generations, and from the shared labor that turned scraps into security. Still, the cold had its way of creeping in, and as the wind howled through wooden walls or snow pressed against windows, sleepers pulled the covers up to their chins, hoping the warmth would last till morning. But what if the quiet of the night was broken not by wind or chill but by something louder? In the quiet hours between sundown and sunrise, American families of the 1800s often found themselves not resting but working. Contrary to the romantic notion of long, peaceful nights, the truth is that sleep was frequently interrupted by chores that simply couldn't be done during the day. The reason: heat, daylight, and shared space. Many households, especially in rural and working-class communities, used every ounce of daylight for fieldwork, factory labor, or shopkeeping. That left the night for domestic tasks. Sleep had to make room. Candles flickered in back kitchens where women quietly mended clothing by lamplight, their fingers moving with practiced rhythm as children snored nearby. In some homes, butter was churned after dark, especially during hot summer days when milk would spoil too quickly. Laundry might be soaked and scrubbed by hand in the hours before dawn to be ready for drying the next day. Men, too, had their midnight obligations. Tools were sharpened, saddles mended. In winter, logs were split by lantern light and stacked silently against cabin walls. Urban families, living in tenement flats, might wake early to fetch water from shared pumps or sweep their stoops before shopkeepers arrived. For many, these nighttime chores were a form of disciplines, something passed down from parent to child. You didn't sleep in if there was firewood to move. You didn't rest if the chickens needed checking. Tasks didn't pause because of the hour. They simply moved with the rhythms of necessity. The sounds of these chores shaped the American night. The soft thunk of an axe on damp wood, the creak of a rocking chair as someone peeled potatoes for tomorrow's stew, the low hiss of a kettle keeping warm, not for tea, but for rinsing dirty clothes. These were not exciting labors, but they were essential, and they created a kind of shared understanding that sleep was a luxury, not a guarantee, that every hour, even those tucked between moonrise and rooster crow, might hold something useful. In towns, the lamplighters made their rounds just as these domestic tasks began, their poles tilted toward gas flames, casting gentle circles of light onto brick alleys and porch steps. Families adjusted their routines to these cycles of shadow and glow, and while some whispered it was unnatural to work by candlelight, others found comfort in these patterns. There was a quiet dignity in finishing the day's work after everyone else had gone to bed. But what happened when these chores piled too high? When exhaustion replaced routine and sleep became a rare, stolen moment? Sleep, in 1800s America, often bowed to the demands of daily survival. For many families, especially those in large households or with small farms, rest wasn't a shared event. It was staggered, fragmented, and sometimes delayed indefinitely. Shifts weren't only for factory workers. In homes without running water or electricity, someone had to rise early or stay up late to keep things going. Mothers fed babies while still half asleep, their bodies swaying to an unseen rhythm. Fathers often went to bed last, checking doors and fires, preparing for storms, or calming animals startled in the night. In colder regions, families took turns waking to stoke the fireplace. Letting the coals die down meant risking freezing temperatures by dawn. So, through each bitter hour, someone was responsible for rising, wrapping a shawl or blanket tightened, tending to the fire. Some households even kept a schedule written beside the hearth, a quiet contract between siblings and spouses. You rise at 2, I'll rise at 4. In cities, noise intruded. Nighttime deliveries of milk or coal clanged through narrow alleys, horses clopped by, lanterns swaying, and with tenements stacked floor upon floor, footsteps, whispers, and creaks passed through thin walls like wind. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did silence. Families learned to doze through interruptions, training themselves to rest in patches. Some workers, like bakers or carriage drivers, had jobs that began when others were ending their day. Sleep came afterward, if at all. Women working in textile mills sometimes returned home at dawn and immediately took over child rearing, while their husbands departed for the fields or docks. In these homes, the bed wasn't a place of long, uninterrupted dreams. It was often a shared, rotating surface. Children might be roused so a tired uncle could rest for 2 hours. Blankets passed from body to body, still warm with the imprint of the last sleeper. This relay of rest was unsentimental but necessary, and yet people adapted. They embraced these rhythms as part of life's quiet order. A nap after lunch, a few minutes of sleep stolen during a sermon, 10 minutes peace with eyes closed while holding a baby. Rest was flexible, like the people who needed it. Modern minds often imagine the past as more peaceful, slower, less chaotic. But the reality is more fragmented. The American night was not a sanctuary from labor. It was an extension of it, and the dream of a full 8 hours under a quilted coverlet that belonged more to fantasy than memory. So how did people keep going year after year with sleep in such short supply?